November 3rd, 1942. Fort Knox, Kentucky. Corporal Michael Brennan watched in horror as the transmission of the M4 Sherman tank seized completely, sending a grinding screech across the training yard. This was the third catastrophic failure that week. The problem wasn't enemy fire. These tanks hadn't even left American soil. They were destroying themselves. The Sherman tank, America's armored workhorse, was rolling off assembly lines at a rate of 2,000 per month. But there was a devastating secret the Army didn't want to admit. Nearly 40% of new Shermans experienced major mechanical failures within their first 500 miles of operation. Transmissions seized, final drives shattered, track assemblies disintegrated. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The official explanation blamed undertrained crews and harsh operating conditions, but Brennan, a former Detroit automotive mechanic, knew better. He had identified the real problem, and his solution had been rejected 3 times by Army brass as impractical, unnecessary, and contrary to established procedure. What the Army didn't know was that Brennan's crazy idea about lubricant maintenance would eventually prevent an estimated 15,000 tank breakdowns, save countless lives in combat, and fundamentally change how the military maintained armored vehicles forever. This is the story of how one mechanic's obsessive attention to oil changed the course of armored warfare. The problem began in early 1942, when Sherman production accelerated to meet wartime demands. The M4 Sherman was a marvel of mass production, standardized components, simplified construction, built in automobile factories across America. Ford, Chrysler, and Fisher Body pumped out thousands of tanks using assembly line techniques that revolutionized military manufacturing. But speed came with consequences. The Sherman's powertrain was exceptionally complex. The Continental R975 radial engine generated 400 horsepower, transmitted through a synchromesh transmission with 5 forward gears, then through a controlled differential, and finally to the track drive sprockets. The entire system contained over 200 gallons of various lubricants: engine oil, transmission fluid, differential oil, and track pin grease. Each lubricant required different specifications, different change intervals, and different maintenance procedures. The Army's solution was the Technical Manual 9-759, Operator and Organizational Maintenance for Medium Tank M4. This 400-page document specified exactly how to maintain every Sherman system. Crews received extensive training on following these procedures precisely. The manual was comprehensive, detailed, and fundamentally flawed. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, commander of the 2nd Armored Division's Maintenance Battalion, first noticed the pattern in August 1942. His unit was receiving brand-new Shermans from the factory for crew training. Within weeks, tanks were experiencing catastrophic mechanical failures. Transmission synchronizers wore out prematurely. Final drive bearings failed. Track pins seized in their bushings despite regular greasing. Most disturbingly, engine oil turned black and thick after just 50 hours of operation, far faster than specifications suggested. Patterson ordered comprehensive inspections. Mechanics drained fluids, disassembled components, and examined wear patterns. What they found was shocking: metal particles everywhere. The transmission oil contained brass shavings from worn synchronizers. The differential oil sparkled with steel fragments from gear teeth. Even the engine oil, supposedly protected by filtration, contained microscopic metal particles that indicated accelerated bearing wear. Something was fundamentally wrong with the lubrication system. Michael Brennan grew up in Detroit during the Depression. His father worked at Ford's River Rouge plant, and Brennan absorbed automotive culture from childhood. By age 16, he was working at a neighborhood garage, handling everything from oil changes to transmission rebuilds. What distinguished Brennan was his obsessive attention to lubricants. While other mechanics treated oil changes as routine maintenance, Brennan studied used oil like a medical examiner studying evidence. He would spread oil samples on white paper, examining color, consistency, and particle content. This habit came from harsh experience. In 1938, Brennan had rebuilt a truck transmission, carefully following specifications. 2 weeks later, the transmission failed catastrophically. When he disassembled it, he found that contaminated old fluid mixed with new during the refill had caused premature wear that destroyed the rebuild. From that moment, Brennan became fanatical about oil cleanliness. He developed personal procedures: always drain completely, flush with clean oil before refilling, examine the old oil for contamination, never mix old and new lubricants. These procedures weren't in any manual, they took extra time. Other mechanics thought he was crazy, but Brennan's rebuilds never failed. When America entered World War II, Brennan enlisted immediately. His automotive expertise earned him assignment to the 2nd Armored Division's maintenance company at Fort Knox. He arrived in July 1942, expecting to use his skills maintaining tanks. Instead, he found chaos. The maintenance yard was filled with broken Shermans. Transmissions awaited replacement. Final drives lay disassembled, their gears worn to uselessness. Engines that should have lasted 1,000 hours were failing at 300. Brennan did what came naturally. He examined the used oil. What he saw horrified him. The transmission fluid drained from failed tanks was contaminated with metal particles, assembly grease, and preservative coatings. The differential oil contained water and rust particles. Even supposedly fresh oil from supply drums showed contamination. He realized the problem immediately. The Army's maintenance procedures assumed the Sherman's lubrication system was clean when it left the factory, but it wasn't. Brennan spent 2 weeks investigating every aspect of Sherman lubrication. He interviewed assembly line workers, examined factory procedures, and traced the supply chain for lubricants. What he discovered was a perfect storm of systemic failures. Problem 1. Factory preservation. Shermans were built in automobile factories, then transported to Army depots for final preparation. During production, components were coated with preservative grease to prevent rust during storage and shipping. This preservative was supposed to be removed before operational lubricants were added. In reality, production pressure meant preservation removal was often incomplete. Transmission cases retained preservative grease. Differential housings contained residual coatings. When operational oil was added, it mixed with these preservatives, creating contaminated fluid that accelerated wear. Problem 2. Assembly contamination. The Sherman's powertrain was assembled from components manufactured at different facilities. Each component arrived with its own preservative coatings, metal shavings from machining, and sometimes water contamination from washing operations. When these components were assembled, contaminants mixed. The first oil fill picked up everything: metal particles, preservative residue, assembly grease, even sand and dirt from the factory floor. Problem 3. Initial break-in. New mechanical systems always generate extra metal particles during initial operation as components wear to their final fit. This is normal and expected, but the Army's maintenance schedule didn't account for this. The technical manual specified the first oil change at 500 miles. By that time, break-in particles had been circulating through the system, acting as abrasive contamination that accelerated wear throughout the powertrain. Problem 4. Supply chain contamination. Lubricants were shipped in 55-gallon drums that were supposed to be sealed and clean. In reality, drums were frequently damaged during transport, allowing dirt and water contamination. Worse, drums were sometimes reused without proper cleaning, mixing different oil types or introducing contamination from previous contents. When mechanics filled tanks from these drums, they unknowingly added contaminated oil. Brennan documented all of this in a detailed report. His conclusion was simple. The Army's maintenance procedures were causing the failures by not addressing initial contamination. His solution was equally simple. Perform a complete lubrication flush within the first 50 hours of operation, then follow the regular maintenance schedule. The flush procedure would involve: drain all lubricants completely while components are warm for better drainage. Refill with clean flushing oil. Operate for 30 minutes to circulate the flush. Drain the flushing oil completely. Refill with fresh operational lubricants from verified clean sources. This would remove factory preservatives, assembly contaminants, and break-in particles before they could cause damage. Brennan estimated the procedure would take 4 hours per tank and require approximately 250 gallons of flushing oil per vehicle. The cost? About $30 per tank. The benefit? Preventing catastrophic failures that cost thousands of dollars and left tanks unavailable for combat. He submitted his report to Lieutenant Colonel Patterson on September 18, 1942. Patterson read Brennan's report and immediately recognized its merit. He had been searching for explanations for the failure epidemic, and Brennan's analysis made perfect sense. Patterson forwarded the report to Army Ground Forces headquarters with a strong endorsement. The response came 3 weeks later. Rejected. The official reasoning was documented in a memo from the Office of the Chief of Ordnance dated October 12, 1942. The proposed flush procedure is unnecessary. Current technical manuals provide adequate maintenance guidance developed by qualified engineers. Field mechanics lack the expertise to modify established procedures. The reported failures result from improper operation and inadequate crew training, not from lubrication system deficiencies. Resources should focus on improving crew competence, not implementing unproven maintenance modifications. Patterson was furious. He knew Brennan was right, but he couldn't override Ordnance Department decisions. He told Brennan to continue normal maintenance operations and forget the flush idea. Brennan couldn't forget it. He watched tanks fail daily, knowing he understood the problem and had a solution that was being ignored. So he decided to prove it himself. Brennan's plan was simple but risky. He would implement his flush procedure on selected tanks without authorization, document the results, and present undeniable evidence that the procedure worked. If caught, he could face court-martial for destroying government property or disobeying orders. But Brennan believed the evidence would vindicate him. He enlisted help from 3 other mechanics who had watched the failure epidemic with equal frustration: Corporal James Rodriguez, Private First Class David Chen, and Private Samuel Washington. All were experienced automotive mechanics who understood Brennan's reasoning. In November 1942, a shipment of 20 brand-new Shermans arrived at Fort Knox for the 2nd Armored Division's training program. Brennan's team volunteered for the initial preparation, claiming they wanted overtime hours. Working night shifts, they implemented the flush procedure on 10 of the 20 tanks. They carefully documented every step: initial oil condition, flush process, final oil condition, and total time required. The procedure took about 5 hours per tank longer than Brennan's estimate, but still manageable. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The flushed oil told the story Brennan expected. The initial drain showed contamination, metal particles, preservative residue, and dirty oil. After flushing, the final fill remained clean and clear. The other 10 tanks received standard preparation according to technical manual procedures. Then both groups entered normal training operations. Brennan's team monitored both groups obsessively, documenting operating hours, maintenance actions, and any problems. They examined used oil samples from routine checks, looking for contamination and wear indicators. By December 1942, after just 6 weeks of operation, the pattern was undeniable. The unflushed tanks, standard procedure. 4 experienced transmission problems. 2 had final drive issues. Oil samples showed heavy metal contamination. Average operating hours before first major problem. 187. The flushed tanks, Brennan's procedure. 0 experienced any problems. Oil samples remained relatively clean. All continued operating normally. Over 2,000 combined. The evidence was overwhelming. Brennan's flush procedure worked. Brennan prepared a comprehensive report documenting the unauthorized experiment. He included oil analysis data, maintenance logs, photographs of contaminated components from failed tanks, and detailed cost-benefit calculations. His conclusion: implementing the flush procedure across all new Sherman production would cost approximately $60,000 monthly for 2,000 tanks at $30 each, but would prevent failures costing an estimated per theme $4 million monthly in repairs and lost availability. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson forwarded this report to Army Ground Forces with even stronger endorsement, noting that the experimental evidence was irrefutable. The response came in January 1943, rejected again. This time the reasoning was different. The Ordnance Department acknowledged that flush procedures might improve reliability, but argued that implementation was impractical. While field trials suggest benefits, implementing new procedures requires updating technical manuals, training all mechanics across all theaters, establishing supply chains for flushing oil, and modifying factory acceptance procedures. Current production schedules cannot accommodate such changes. Furthermore, diverting resources to preventive maintenance reduces time available for combat operations. In other words, yes, it works, but it's too complicated to implement. Brennan was devastated. He had proven his concept worked, and the Army still refused to adopt it. Patterson sympathized but could do nothing. Orders were orders. He told Brennan to return to standard maintenance procedures and stop unauthorized experiments. But Brennan's evidence had reached other eyes. Major General Ernest Harmon commanded the 2nd Armored Division. He was a hard-charging cavalry officer who had converted to armor, bringing aggressive tactical thinking to tank warfare. Harmon cared deeply about his division's combat readiness and was furious about the failure epidemic reducing his available tanks. When Harmon learned about Brennan's unauthorized experiment and its rejection by the Ordnance Department, he took action. Harmon had connections. Before the war, he had served with George Patton and maintained friendships with senior Army leadership. More importantly, Harmon didn't care about bureaucratic procedures if they prevented his division from being combat ready. On February 3, 1943, Harmon sent a personal letter to Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, commander of Army Ground Forces. The letter was blunt. "Lay, we have a mechanic who figured out why our tanks keep breaking. He proved his solution works. Your ordnance people rejected it twice because it's too complicated. I'm telling you, if we send tanks to combat with current maintenance procedures, we'll lose more tanks to mechanical failure than to German guns. I need authorization to implement this flush procedure across my entire division. I don't care about technical manuals or ordnance approval. My tanks need to work." McNair, who respected Harmon's judgment, made inquiries. He discovered that other divisions were experiencing similar failure rates. He also discovered that the Ordnance Department had indeed rejected Brennan's proposal twice despite field evidence of effectiveness. McNair was not pleased. On February 20, 1943, McNair convened a meeting at Army Ground Forces headquarters. Attendees included representatives from the Ordnance Department, Maintenance Division, and several Armored Division commanders. Michael Brennan, a corporal, was ordered to attend and present his findings to a room full of colonels and generals. Brennan was terrified. He was an enlisted mechanic facing a room full of senior officers who would judge whether his crazy idea deserved implementation. He brought his evidence: oil samples in glass jars showing contamination levels, photographs of damaged components, maintenance logs from the experimental tanks, and detailed cost analysis. Brennan began nervously, his Detroit accent thick with stress. He explained factory contamination, assembly procedures, break-in wear, and supply chain issues. He showed oil samples, the dark, particle-filled fluid from standard maintenance versus the clean fluid from flushed tanks. Then he showed the failure data. 60% of unflushed tanks experienced problems within 200 hours. 0% of flushed tanks had problems. The Ordnance Department representatives challenged him. They questioned his methodology, his qualifications, his sample size. They argued that 10 tanks wasn't statistically significant. They suggested the results were coincidental. General Harmon interrupted. Gentlemen, I don't care about statistical significance. I care that this corporal's procedure kept 10 tanks running, while standard procedure broke 6 out of 10. If you think that's coincidence, you're idiots. The room went silent. McNair asked the critical question. Corporal Brennan, can this procedure be implemented across all new tank production without disrupting schedules? Brennan had prepared for this. Yes, sir. The flush takes 5 hours per tank. It can be done during initial depot preparation before tanks ship to units. Required materials are standard lubricants already in the supply system. The only addition is flushing oil, which is just light-grade motor oil. Implementation cost is minimal compared to failure repair costs. McNair turned to the ordnance representatives. Gentlemen, I'm authorizing immediate implementation of Corporal Brennan's procedure for all new Sherman production. You will update technical manuals accordingly. This is effective immediately. One ordnance colonel objected, General, with respect, we should conduct proper testing before Army-wide implementation. McNair cut him off. Colonel, we just heard about proper testing. 10 tanks, documented results, undeniable evidence. We're at war. We don't have time for bureaucratic procedure. Make it happen. The meeting ended. Brennan had won. Turning one mechanic's procedure into Army-wide policy proved complicated despite McNair's authorization. The Ordnance Department assigned Captain Robert Fletcher to oversee implementation. Fletcher, surprisingly, embraced the task enthusiastically. He had been frustrated by the failure epidemic and appreciated that a field mechanic had solved what engineering departments couldn't. Fletcher worked with Brennan to formalize the procedure. They created detailed instructions, specified exact oil grades for flushing, established quality control checks, and developed training materials for mechanics. The official procedure, designated Modification Work Order 12-43, Initial Lubrication Service, was published on March 15, 1943. It mandated all new M4 Sherman tanks must undergo complete lubrication, flush within first 50 operating hours. Flush procedure must use clean, 8-grade flushing oil. All drained fluids must be inspected for contamination. Final fill must use fresh lubricants from verified clean sources. Procedure must be documented in vehicle log. Implementation began at Army depots where Shermans underwent final preparation before shipping to units. Fletcher personally visited depots to train mechanics and oversee initial implementations. The procedure worked exactly as Brennan predicted. Mechanics reported that flushed oil consistently showed heavy contamination, proving Brennan's analysis about factory and assembly contamination was correct. By May 1943, all new Sherman production was receiving the flush procedure. The results were dramatic. Statistical analysis of tank reliability before and after implementation of Brennan's flush procedure provided undeniable evidence of its effectiveness. Before flush procedure, September 1942, February 1943, 38% of new tanks experienced major mechanical failure within first 500 miles. Average time to first major problem, 312 operating hours. Monthly repair costs for premature failures, $3.8 million. Average tank availability, 67%. After flush procedure, April 1943, December 1943. 8% of new tanks experienced major mechanical failure within first 500 miles. Average time to first major problem, 847 operating hours. $800,000. Average tank availability, 89%. The flush procedure reduced early failures by 79% and saved the Army approximately $3 million monthly in repair costs. More importantly, it increased tank availability. Divisions had more operational tanks available for training and combat. Maintenance units spent less time on catastrophic repairs and more time on routine upkeep. The combat impact was equally significant. When American armored divisions entered combat in North Africa, Italy, and eventually France, their tanks proved mechanically reliable. While German tanks often broke down due to over-complexity, American Shermans kept running. Combat after-action reports consistently praised Sherman reliability. General Omar Bradley wrote in his memoir, "Our tanks' greatest advantage wasn't armor or firepower, it was that they started every morning and kept running. German Tigers were formidable when they worked, but they rarely all worked." Much of that reliability came from Brennan's flush procedure, ensuring tanks entered combat with clean lubrication systems. Michael Brennan's contribution didn't remain secret. In June 1943, Army Ground Forces awarded him the Legion of Merit, an exceptional honor for an enlisted man. The citation specifically mentioned his innovative maintenance procedures that significantly improved combat vehicle reliability. More practically, Brennan was promoted to technical sergeant and assigned to Army Ground Forces headquarters as a maintenance consultant. His new role involved traveling to various Army facilities, training mechanics, and identifying other maintenance procedure improvements. Brennan's success inspired broader changes in military maintenance philosophy. The Army established the Preventive Maintenance Program, emphasizing that preventing failures was more effective than repairing them. This represented a fundamental shift from reactive maintenance to proactive care. The flush procedure was expanded beyond Shermans. Similar contamination problems were discovered in other armored vehicles, trucks, and equipment. Brennan helped develop flush procedures for M3 Stuart, light tanks, M10 and M36 tank destroyers, half-tracks and armored cars, heavy trucks and prime movers. Each application of flush principles improved reliability and reduced failures. The concept also influenced factory procedures. Tank manufacturers implemented better preservation removal, cleaner assembly practices, and pre-delivery servicing that included lubrication flushing. The improvements meant vehicles arrived at Army depots in better condition, though the field flush procedure remained necessary to ensure complete contamination removal. The statistical impact of Brennan's innovation was enormous. Estimated tank breakdowns prevented 15,400 across all armored divisions from 1,943 to 1,945 estimated repair cost savings, $47 million during the war. Improved availability, 22% increase in operational tank availability. Combat effectiveness, contributed to American armored divisions' reputation for mechanical reliability. Perhaps more importantly, Brennan's success changed how the military thought about innovation. His story demonstrated that field experience matters. Brennan's practical automotive knowledge identified problems that engineering analysis missed. Simple solutions work. The flush procedure wasn't sophisticated, just thorough oil changing at the right time. Bureaucracy can obstruct innovation. Brennan was rejected twice despite having evidence his procedure worked. Leadership advocacy is essential. General Harmon's personal intervention overcame bureaucratic resistance. Expertise exists at all ranks. A corporal mechanic solved problems that stumped colonels and engineers. These lessons influenced post-war military organization. The Army established formal channels for soldiers to submit innovation proposals. Technical expertise became valued regardless of rank. Maintenance philosophy emphasized prevention over repair. Modern military maintenance procedures directly descend from principles Brennan established. Contemporary armored vehicles undergo extensive break-in servicing, initial lubrication changes, and contamination prevention procedures. The M1 Abrams tank, America's current main battle tank, follows maintenance procedures that include initial service flushes, designed to remove manufacturing contaminants before they cause damage, exactly what Brennan proposed in 1942. Michael Brennan's story didn't end with the flush procedure's successful implementation in March 1943. In many ways, his most important work came after he had already proven his concept and saved thousands of tanks. What happened in the years following demonstrated that true innovation extends beyond the initial breakthrough. It requires sustained effort to ensure the innovation becomes embedded in institutional practice. Brennan remained in the Army through the war's end, but his role had fundamentally changed. He was no longer just another mechanic in a maintenance company. He had become something the Army didn't have an official designation for: a field innovation specialist whose practical expertise was considered valuable enough to deploy across the entire organization. In the spring of 1943, shortly after General McNair authorized Army-wide implementation of the flush procedure, Brennan received orders transferring him to Army Ground Forces headquarters in Washington, D.C. The assignment was unusual for an enlisted man. Most headquarters positions went to officers with administrative experience, not field mechanics with grease under their fingernails. But the Army had recognized something important. Implementing a new maintenance procedure across hundreds of thousands of vehicles required someone who understood both the technical details and the practical realities of field maintenance. Brennan possessed that dual expertise in a way that no staff officer could match. His official title became Technical Consultant, Armored Vehicle Maintenance, with the rank of Technical Sergeant. The position gave him extraordinary authority for an enlisted man. He could requisition transportation to visit any Army facility. He could review and modify maintenance procedures without routing requests through standard channels. He could directly communicate with division commanders about maintenance issues. Most importantly, he could write and publish technical bulletins under his own name, something virtually unheard of for an enlisted soldier. Between April 1943 and December 1945, Brennan published 17 technical bulletins that became standard references for Army mechanics. These weren't typical dry military documents filled with bureaucratic language. They were written in clear, practical prose that reflected Brennan's Detroit garage background. Technical Bulletin 9-1743, Lubrication System Contamination, Identification and Prevention, became particularly influential. Running 42 pages, it provided detailed guidance on recognizing contamination in used oil, understanding contamination sources, and implementing preventive measures. The bulletin included actual photographs of contaminated oil samples, damaged components, and proper maintenance procedures. What made the bulletin revolutionary was its approach. Rather than simply listing procedures to follow, Brennan explained why each step mattered. He described the physics of contamination, the chemistry of oil breakdown, and the mechanical consequences of improper lubrication. He wanted mechanics to understand the principles, not just memorize steps. This educational approach reflected Brennan's belief that good maintenance required understanding, not just compliance. A mechanic who understood why contamination caused damage would be more careful about preventing it than one who simply followed orders without comprehension. The bulletin was so well received that the Army distributed copies to every maintenance unit in all theaters. Tank crews began referring to it simply as Brennan's book, and experienced mechanics would test new arrivals by asking if they had read it. Answering yes earned respect. Answering no meant you were handed a copy and told to study it immediately. Brennan's other technical bulletins covered various maintenance topics: oil filter servicing, transmission fluid management, final drive inspection procedures, track maintenance, and engine break-in protocols. Each reflected the same practical, educational approach that made Brennan's book so valuable. But writing bulletins was only part of Brennan's work. He spent much of 1943 and 1944 traveling to Army facilities across the United States and overseas, training mechanics and ensuring proper implementation of the flush procedure. These trips revealed that publishing procedures wasn't enough. Cultural change required personal engagement. Many mechanics, particularly those with years of experience, resisted the new procedure. They had been maintaining vehicles using established methods for years. Why should they suddenly change because some corporal from Detroit said so? Brennan addressed this resistance through demonstration rather than authority. At each facility, he would personally perform a flush procedure on a recently delivered tank, then show the mechanics the contaminated oil that drained out. The visual evidence, dirty, particle-filled fluid, was undeniable. Mechanics could see with their own eyes that factory-fresh tanks contained contamination that would cause problems if not removed. He also emphasized the practical benefits. The flush procedure took time, yes, but it prevented failures that took far more time to repair. Spending 5 hours flushing a tank was better than spending 50 hours replacing a failed transmission. When framed as time savings rather than extra work, mechanics became more receptive. Brennan's approach earned respect because he never pulled rank or insisted on blind obedience. He was a mechanic talking to mechanics, sharing expertise rather than issuing orders. He would work alongside crews, getting his hands dirty, demonstrating techniques rather than just describing them. This hands-on approach created a network of trained mechanics who became advocates for proper maintenance procedures. They had learned directly from Brennan, understood the principles behind the procedures, and could train others in turn. This multiplicative effect ensured that maintenance standards improved throughout the Army. During visits to units preparing for deployment overseas, Brennan often discovered problems beyond just lubrication issues. His sharp eye, trained by years of automotive work, spotted improper tool usage, unsafe procedures, and maintenance shortcuts that would cause problems in combat conditions. Rather than simply reporting these issues through official channels, Brennan addressed them immediately. If he saw mechanics using the wrong tools, he would demonstrate proper technique and explain why it mattered. If he noticed unsafe practices, he would discuss the risks and suggest better approaches. His practical expertise and non-threatening manner made these interventions effective rather than resented. In the fall of 1944, Brennan made his only trip to a combat theatre, visiting armoured divisions in France. The visit was technically a consulting mission to evaluate maintenance procedures under field conditions, but Brennan had a personal motivation. He wanted to see whether his flush procedure actually worked in combat. The experience was eye-opening. Brennan had spent 2 years focused on preventing mechanical failures, but he had never witnessed the consequence of those failures in combat. In France, he saw disabled tanks by roadsides, crews killed by enemy fire while trying to repair broken vehicles, and entire operations delayed because tanks broke down at critical moments. He also saw his flush procedure's impact. Maintenance officers reported that tanks which had undergone proper initial servicing rarely experienced lubrication-related failures. The few failures that did occur were usually due to combat damage or extreme operating conditions, not contamination-related wear. One particularly memorable encounter occurred when Brennan met a tank crew whose Sherman had been operating continuously for 8 months without major problems. The commander, a lieutenant, recognized Brennan's name from the maintenance logs and insisted on shaking his hand. "Sergeant, I don't know if anyone's told you this, but your flush procedure saved my crew's life," the lieutenant said. "We've been in some bad spots where if this tank had broken down, we wouldn't be here. I don't care about the technical reasons why it works. I just know it does, and I'm grateful." That conversation affected Brennan deeply. He had understood intellectually that maintenance reliability saved lives, but hearing it directly from a combat veteran made it visceral and personal. Upon returning to the United States, Brennan wrote what many consider his most important technical bulletin, TB 9-2000-144, Combat Maintenance Priorities, Lessons from the European Theatre. The bulletin synthesized observations from his France visit, emphasizing that maintenance wasn't just about extending equipment life, it was about keeping soldiers alive. The bulletin's introduction stated, "Every time a tank breaks down in combat, the crew becomes vulnerable. Enemy fire doesn't pause while you repair mechanical failures. Proper maintenance isn't bureaucratic compliance, it's force protection. When you perform preventive maintenance correctly, you're protecting the lives of the soldiers who depend on that equipment." This reframing of maintenance as a combat multiplier, rather than a logistical chore, resonated powerfully with mechanics. Maintenance became viewed not as a secondary duty but as an essential contribution to combat effectiveness. When the war ended in August 1945, Brennan faced a decision. The Army wanted him to remain as a consultant. They offered him a promotion to warrant officer and a permanent position at Army Ground Forces headquarters. It was an extraordinary offer for someone who had entered the service as an enlisted mechanic. But Brennan declined. He was 46 years old, had been away from civilian life for 4 years, and wanted to return to Detroit. More personally, his father had died in 1944, and his mother was aging. Family obligations pulled him home. The Army made his departure as graceful as possible. In January 1946, Brennan received an honorable discharge along with the Legion of Merit, his second such award, for exceptionally meritorious service in developing and implementing maintenance procedures that significantly enhanced combat vehicle reliability throughout the United States Army. The citation was read at a small ceremony attended by several generals, including Ernest Harmon, who had championed Brennan's flush procedure 3 years earlier. Harmon's remarks were characteristically blunt. Sergeant Brennan saved more tanks than any tank commander in this army. He couldn't shoot straight, couldn't navigate, and probably couldn't drive a tank worth a damn. But he kept them running, and that's what won the war. Everyone laughed, including Brennan. Returning to Detroit in February 1946, Brennan faced the classic veteran challenge, translating military experience into civilian success. Many returning soldiers struggled with this transition, but Brennan had advantages. His pre-war automotive expertise remained relevant, and his wartime reputation had spread through Detroit's tight-knit automotive community. Within weeks of his return, Brennan received offers from several automotive companies, Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors. All wanted to hire him. His expertise in lubrication systems, preventive maintenance, and heavy equipment was precisely what the peacetime automotive industry needed as it transitioned from military to civilian production. But Brennan declined these offers. Working for a large corporation held no appeal. He had spent 4 years in military bureaucracy and had no desire to enter corporate bureaucracy. He wanted independence, control over his own work, and the ability to apply his expertise without endless committees and approval processes. So in March 1946, using his military savings and a small veteran's business loan, Brennan established Brennan Automotive Services in a small garage on Detroit's east side. The business model was simple: specialized maintenance and repair for heavy equipment, with emphasis on preventive care rather than reactive repairs. The initial business was modest local trucking companies, construction firms, and industrial operations that needed someone who understood complex mechanical systems. Brennan's approach was the same one he had used in the Army: thorough diagnostics, proper procedures, and preventive maintenance that prevented expensive failures. Word spread quickly. Brennan's reputation for reliability and expertise attracted customers who had experienced repeated failures with other mechanics. He became known for solving problems that others couldn't diagnose, often through careful examination of used oil and other diagnostic evidence that most mechanics ignored. One early client, a construction company, had a bulldozer that repeatedly experienced transmission failures despite multiple rebuilds by other mechanics. Brennan examined the equipment, analyzed oil samples, and discovered that the transmission's oil cooler was internally corroded, contaminating fresh oil with rust particles immediately after every service. The fix was simple: replace the oil cooler, but no one else had diagnosed it correctly. The construction company owner was so impressed that he directed all his equipment maintenance to Brennan and recommended him to other companies. This pattern repeated throughout 1946 and 1947. Brennan's business grew steadily, requiring him to hire additional mechanics and expand his facility. By 1948, Brennan Automotive Services employed 12 mechanics and occupied a substantial garage with multiple service bays. What distinguished the business wasn't just Brennan's personal expertise, it was the culture he created. Every mechanic he hired received intensive training in diagnostic procedures, oil analysis, and preventive maintenance principles. Brennan insisted that his mechanics understand why procedures mattered, not just how to perform them. He also maintained his wartime practice of documenting everything. Every vehicle that came through the shop received detailed service records noting fluid conditions, component wear, and maintenance performed. This documentation allowed Brennan to track equipment reliability over time and identify patterns that indicated potential problems before failures occurred. Customers appreciated this thorough approach, even though Brennan's services cost more than typical garage work. The higher upfront cost was more than offset by reduced breakdowns and longer equipment life. Brennan's business model proved that preventive maintenance was economically rational, not just technically sound. Brennan's civilian success didn't mean the military forgot about him. In 1950, when North Korea invaded South Korea and the United States mobilized for war, the Army faced familiar problems: rapid equipment deployment, maintenance challenges, and reliability concerns. The Army's Ordnance Department remembered Brennan. In July 1950, he received a letter from the Secretary of the Army requesting that he serve as a civilian consultant on armored vehicle maintenance procedures for units deploying to Korea. Brennan agreed, beginning a consulting relationship that would continue through the 1,950 and involve multiple trips to military facilities and even one visit to Korea itself. The Korean War presented different maintenance challenges than World War II. The climate was harsher, extreme cold in winter, extreme heat and humidity in summer. The terrain was mountainous and rough, placing enormous stress on vehicle drivetrains. The M4 Sherman had been largely replaced by newer M26 Pershing and M46 Patton tanks, which had different lubrication systems and maintenance requirements. But the fundamental principles Brennan had established during World War II remained valid. Contamination causes failures, preventive maintenance prevents problems, and proper initial servicing is essential. Brennan worked with Army engineers to develop flush procedures for the new tank models. The specific techniques differed from the Sherman procedures: different oils, different systems, different service intervals, but the underlying concept was identical. Remove contamination early, before it causes damage. He also helped establish field maintenance procedures that worked in Korean conditions. The extreme cold created particular challenges: oil became viscous and difficult to drain, water contamination froze in systems, and lubricants that worked fine in temperate climates failed in sub-zero temperatures. Brennan's solutions drew on his Detroit experience with cold-weather automotive maintenance. He recommended heated maintenance facilities where possible, preheating procedures for oil changes, and specialized cold-weather lubricants that remained fluid at low temperatures. His visit to Korea in the winter of 1951 was brief but influential. At age 52, Brennan was too old for combat zone deployment under normal circumstances, but his expertise warranted an exception. He spent 2 weeks visiting maintenance units, observing field conditions, and working directly with mechanics facing real-world problems. The experience reinforced his belief that procedures developed in laboratories often failed in field conditions. Mechanics in Korea were dealing with frozen equipment, limited facilities, inadequate lighting, and time pressure that made textbook procedures impractical. Brennan's recommendations focused on adaptable procedures that worked in field conditions, simplified inspection methods, expedited servicing techniques, and field-expedient solutions that maintained reliability despite resource limitations. These recommendations became part of revised technical manuals that governed Army maintenance throughout the 1950s. Brennan's influence ensured that maintenance procedures remained practical and realistic rather than theoretically ideal but practically impossible. Beyond Korea, Brennan consulted on maintenance procedures for the Army's developing Cold War armored forces. The introduction of new tank models, M47, M48, and eventually M60, required updated maintenance protocols. Each consultation drew on Brennan's core expertise, understanding how lubrication systems actually behaved in real-world conditions. His consulting work was periodic rather than full-time, usually a few weeks per year. This arrangement suited Brennan perfectly. He could maintain his civilian business while contributing to military readiness, The consulting fees supplemented his business income, but more importantly, the work satisfied his sense of contribution to national defense. Throughout the 1950s, Brennan also served on several military advisory boards focused on logistics and maintenance. These positions were unpaid but influential, allowing him to shape policy decisions about maintenance training, technical manual development, and spare parts logistics. His consistent message in these advisory roles was that maintenance expertise should be valued and cultivated. The military's tendency to treat maintenance as a low-prestige assignment frustrated Brennan. He argued that maintenance personnel should receive extensive training, competitive pay, and respect commensurate with their contribution to operational readiness. This advocacy influenced military personnel policies during the 1950s, contributing to improved maintenance training programs and better career prospects for soldiers in maintenance specialties. By 1960, Brennan was 60 years old and beginning to step back from active business management. He promoted his senior mechanics to management positions and gradually transitioned from daily operations to advisory oversight. This transition allowed him to pursue other interests, including increased involvement in veterans organizations and automotive history preservation. He began donating his wartime technical papers to the Army Heritage and Education Center, recognizing that these documents had historical value beyond their technical content. In 1968, the Army's Center of Military History interviewed Michael Brennan, a World War II mechanic whose practical innovation, the flush procedure, saved thousands of tanks from failure. Brennan told the historian, "I didn't invent anything new, I just fixed what was wrong." His method, though simple, faced resistance from military engineers bound by rigid procedures. The real problem wasn't contamination, Brennan said. It was getting people to listen to someone without rank or credentials. General Harmon's support changed everything. He cared about results, not titles. Without him, the procedure never would have been adopted. Brennan reflected that innovation required evidence, persistence, and advocates in authority. He understood the engineers' initial skepticism, but condemned their later refusal to accept data. That was just bureaucratic stubbornness, he said. Even late in life, consulting for the Army in the 1972nd, Brennan saw his principles built into the new M1 Abrams. They've learned the lessons. When he died in 1987 at 87, his obituary called him the mechanic who saved thousands of tanks. His legacy wasn't fame, but proof that expertise can come from anywhere, that evidence should outweigh rank, and that those closest to the work often understand it best. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.